Yeah.
Hello, and welcome back to Yuricon 2023. We have a very exciting guest today, Paul DeMerrit-Verrone, who is going to be talking to us today about the power to bring the revolution. So welcome, Paul. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So you contacted me by email, and we're asking some questions about the connection between shoujo manga, Yuri manga, and the student movement of the 60s and 70s. So could you tell us a little bit, well, I suppose, first, please introduce yourself, and then tell us a bit about your research into the 60s student movement and the relationship to manga.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first off, thanks so much for having me. It's really a treat to be here. By Your Side was one of the first books I read when I was looking into all this stuff. And it's been a super helpful resource for me. So really a treat to be here. My name is Paul. I live in Atlanta, musician, writer. None of what I do for work has anything to do with this. This is all just kind of my own passion project and sort of hobby interests. So my research into this really started when I became pretty obsessed with the show Revolutionary Girl Utena, which
As we all did.
Yes. I've come to know that people that are Utena fans are really big Utena fans. So I first watched it at the beginning of last year. It was a really important show to me for a number of reasons. But I think one of the things that I got really into was just how layered the show is. I mean, you can kind of enjoy it purely for its aesthetic value, but there's so much to dig into. And after I watched Utena for the first time, I watched the rest of the works by the director Kunihiko Ikuhara, like Penguin Drum, Yurikuma Rashi, Stars on Mai. And I just started watching all these shows and getting really, really into them. I started really wondering what are the sort of themes and influences behind Ikuhara's work. And that really got me into this whole broader history of Yuri and shoujo. And I think what was really interesting to me about Ikuhara's work is how he sort of interweaves these commentaries on the history of Yuri and shoujo with broader commentaries on the history of sort of like politics and society within Japan in the last 50 years and into the 21st century.
Sure.
And that got me into reading a lot of interviews with him. And he started mentioning this thing called the student movement, which I had never heard of before. And I had kind of bought into this idea or this stereotype that Japan as society is very sort of has a huge deference towards authority. And there's not really much of, social sort of movements like we know them maybe in other places. And so to learn about this whole history of social revolution among students in the 50s and 60s and into the early 70s in Japan was really, really fascinating to me. I had no idea that it even existed. And then as I started looking into it, I started realizing that the whole history of manga and anime was really tied to the history of the student movement in the 50s and 60s. Many animators either participated directly in the student movement or were influenced by it directly. And that was just really fascinating to me. And so I just kept going deeper and deeper in the rabbit hole. And I wanted to know more. And as I got into it more, I realized that there's a lot of history in the English language, at least, written about the relationship between shonen manga and anime in the student movement, but much less written about shoujo, Yuri, and boys' love in the student movement, even though it was happening at the same time, and that there are these connections through works like Rose of Versailles and Utena. So I really wanted to dig up as much of that history as I could because I didn't see as much written about it, but I felt like there was more there. So that's kind of the genesis of all this.
That's really absolutely fantastic. And I mean, I think you're absolutely right. A lot of people come into anime manga and they think, well, Japan is a, homogeneous society and nobody really argues and nobody really, that's the impression that we're given. It's the impression that, of course, the Japanese government would like. And then you get the nuclear protests of a few years ago, where it's the biggest protest the country's ever seen. And people are like, oh, and it's of course, nobody's sitting here doing nothing, and we just don't necessarily see that. So that's amazing. So thank you. And thank you for doing the research, because I think that's really important. And I would love to read it when you're done with it. So obviously the theme of revolution is most easily connected to the Rose of Versailles. And that's partially because it's set in a revolution in its own. But also, what do you think about the period of time and the things that Ikeda Sensei was trying to say about revolution?
Yeah. Maybe I'll back up and give a really quick overview about maybe what the student movement was, without getting too professor presenty about it. Also, just to give a caveat that I do not speak Japanese, so I apologize in advance to your viewers for any butchering of pronunciations that I am inevitably going to do. So yeah, maybe just a quick history of kind of what led up to the time period in which Rose of Versailles was written in the early 70s. So as I understand it, the student movement kind of, you can maybe trace it back to post-World War II, when you had a new constitution written for Japan. You had this new opening up of democratic rights and rights to organize, and especially rights to have political parties in Japan. And so after World War II, you had this kind of flourishing of leftist movements in Japan. You had the Japanese Communist Party start, and then you had a lot of student movements and organizations that were attached to that. And so through the 50s, you had a lot of social unrest in Japan, especially going towards 1960, as that was when the US-Japanese Security Treaty was signed in 1960. And that was a big protest point because a lot of people in Japan were very wary about being drawn into another war, which is very reasonable fear to have, given that the Korean War was happening and then the Vietnam War was going to happen in the 60s. And so they were very wary of being drawn into kind of a further military sort of tie with the United States. And so in 1960, you had a lot of student movements kind of protest that security treaty. You had a lot of leftist political parties and a lot of kind of ultra-conservative political parties as well protested, because they kind of didn't want to see Japan's autonomy tied to the United States. And so even despite all those protests, which were really, really massive, there was a massive general strike that had something like 6 million people go on strike in Japan at the time. But even despite all of this pushback, the security treaty was still signed, even despite the fact that it was super unpopular. But what I think was really interesting is that got a lot of students into politics, and it really kind of had this severing effect of student movements from the Japanese Communist Party at the time, which is very hierarchical, very top down. And so you had a lot of student movements, organizations associated with universities, especially, kind of have this break from that. So in the 60s, you had what was called very loosely as like the New Left, which was a lot of, like I said, organizations and universities that maybe had leftist ideas or were wanting to protest against things like the Vietnam War or against nuclear testing. Or against conditions for students in universities in Japan. They wanted to address all those issues without being attached to this big, top-down party that was the Japanese Communist Party. So throughout the 60s, and really more so in the later 60s, especially going toward 1967, you had a lot of students begin to organize for the first time and really have a big pushback against sort of the pressures of university and schooling in Japan at the time. You had like very strict sort of rigorous testing system that was just kind of pushing students through this meat grinder of education into being these like very confined, constrained professional roles. And like I said, you also had that amidst the backdrop of the Vietnam War starting, and a lot of students, I think, directly saw the rise of Japan as a consumerist society to the Vietnam War, and saw this relationship between capitalism and imperialism and all that. So that really hit ahead in 1967, 68, when you had a lot of protests happen in universities against unpaid internships, against a lot of corruption in university management. And so that really blossomed, I think, in 1968, when you started having these organizations called Zen Kyotos, which basically were these decentralized student organizations that started to actually barricade universities, where they would basically kick university professors, administrators out and barricade universities from police getting in. So it was this massive rupture in the university system, especially places like the University of Tokyo, which were these sort of I don't know, factories, maybe for lack of a better word, for pushing students into these professional classes. So you had students wanting to break away from their very rigid expectations in society and try to create a new sort of world for themselves. And
And this
so
is the same thing that we saw over here in America. This is the same thing. This is very similar, and frankly, we're back in the same buckets, it's I'm waiting for those student revolutions to happen again, frankly.
Yeah, no, and that's what's so cool about this is once I heard about it, I was like, wow, this is such an amazing moment, which seems so hard to imagine now when a lot of social movements really are very constrained and pretty harshly repressed. So it's amazing to imagine that amount of change being pushed by students, and especially because I think we think of like the late 60s happening maybe in America or Paris or something like that. We don't think of like the revolution in the 60s happening in Japan. So that's just a really
which is obviously our bias, not the world, it's like, and then to some extent it's English language historians. I mean, nobody's saying that when you learn about that in school, nobody's saying, and also the rest of the world too, yes. And here's some things that we need to know. We aren't told those things. So it's good for you to tell that. So then what themes do you think about those movements became part of Rose of Versailles? And what do you think, or were there any messages that you think Ikeda was trying to say?
Yeah, so maybe to make a long story short, at the end of the student movement in the 60s, it got repressed pretty harshly, and a lot of those currents got pretty violent. And so the kind of maybe like, I don't know, spiritual death of the student movement happened in like the early 70s, and we had a couple really militant factions of it really get exposed for being very, very violent towards their own members, and kind of this whole idea of like the revolution eating its children, that happened in a very real way. And so I think people, once they saw the violence of that, they kind of saw that as like being a break of like, well, we can't have these leftist movements because they're so violent. They're only going to lead to these really awful, power grabs and stuff like that. And one thing that was a big current in the student movement was the fact that it was very patriarchal. It was very much driven by men and very much driven by like these ideas of like masculinity and aggression and self-empowerment, and a very
again very much like those in the United States as well.
Totally. And of course there were almost no strains of kind of like queer liberation that were a part of the student movement. Very masculine centered. And so that links back to the Rose of Versailles in a very direct way, because Ryoko Ikeda was actually a member of the Japanese Communist Party when she was in university. And there's this really interesting anecdote I found where she said she once wore a red dress to some Japanese Communist Party related meeting among students, and they shamed her for having paid attention to her appearance because it was seen as it basically, if you were seen as like being too feminine, then that was too bourgeoisie, and you weren't committed to the movement, and that very much being feminine was seen as counter-revolutionary to a lot of people.
Isn't that fascinating that nothing has changed? Like literally nothing has changed. Like we are doing the same conversations now for the same reasons. It's fascinating. Do you think that in manga, shoujo manga generally, the concept of revolution is a significant theme for that period of time?
Yeah, I think in Rose of Versailles especially is because she has this very interesting framing of having characters like Lady Oscar, who is this like very beautiful revolutionary who doesn't have to make this sort of false binary of like, well, you get to be beautiful or you get to be revolutionary and care about social issues. You can be both. And so the Rose
but
of
also
Versailles,
from a privileged position. So she comes into it with a great deal of privilege to be able to not care what other people think, which is again something that could exist.
Totally. I think that's also like maybe a critique some people have made of Rose of Versailles, is that the revolutionary Lady Oscar is this very privileged person who gets to fight on behalf of maybe the lower classes, but is still very much wealthy in and of herself. But I think in Rose of Versailles, the themes of revolution are tied very directly from Ikeda's own experiences. I think with the other authors associated with the year 24 movement of the whole sort of, breadth of really influential shoujo authors that were coming about at the time, most of them women. I mean, I think a lot of the revolution was more personal and in nature, and was maybe less explicitly political, but reflected the broader currents of the women's movement that was happening at the time, which was very much a reaction against the patriarchal current of the student movement. And so you had a lot of
And the existing
stories.
patriarchy, which was not moving anyway. So you basically had, either way you go, you have nothing but patriarchy in either direction.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And that's not even like getting into like the structure of like the manga industry, which was
Yeah,
super
right.
male. So I think even though like maybe some of the other works around the time weren't as explicitly political as Rosa Versailles was, they were still just as revolutionary in that they were bringing these complex stories of love into the forefront of manga for the first time, and especially a lot of very layered queer stories in Boys Love and Yuri that were, I know it's very interesting to me because I saw a few authors say that like some Boys Love was mainly just written for heterosexual female audiences, and that was just a way for like women to be able to like project themselves onto these characters that
It's
looked
certainly one aspect of it. It's not the only aspect of it.
totally, yeah. And I think it's fascinating because it's so complex.
Yeah, when you start looking at it, I mean, you can't separate the personal as political, right? And
Yeah.
women, when they write, largely work with personal situations and relationships and people, as opposed to things and ideas, because of the way society tends to sort of shunt them into, you know, shopping and things and families and people, and not great political movements, you know. And this is the important stuff for men. So you have a certain reflection of how they're trained, but also maybe individual predilection where, you know, I don't really care about the bigger, greater things. I just care about people and things. So certainly I know that I'm very interested in ideas first and things second and people last. So when I write, that's how I write. And then you're going to get a little bit of that. And of course, when you have editors of these magazines going, yes, women want to read about relationships and love. And so there's a certain market force as well in any of this. Like, okay, I guess I'm writing about that, you know, and so I can write about the personal as political, you know, political revolution in personal revolution, and how things are looking different. So I think there's always a bit of, you know, both sides of that and all of that.
Yeah.
So you generally think that the revolution is the revolution. We're going to go with the revolution,
Yeah.
as if it's a thing and not a constant process.
Right.
So you think overall it's a fairly significant theme for the Year 24 group or shoujo manga at the time?
Yeah, definitely. And as I was, you know, emailing, you know, folks like yourself who have done a lot of research into this, the answer I got time and time again asking about like, well, what's the relationship between these social currents and manga and anime at the time, was that even if there is an explicit reference to it, it was happening. Everyone knew it was happening.
You
and
can't
so
separate yourself from the social movements that literally are outside your door.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people made the point too that a lot of like explicitly political stuff wasn't really favored by publishers, and even to have an author talk about that in interviews was sometimes seen as, you know, not some. Yeah, exactly. So I mean, you have to consider all that as well. That even if the link isn't, you know, completely clear, it's still in the background. And I think too, it's really interesting seeing how shoujo manga, you know, got to sort of be more political, I guess, you know, because you had stuff like Gundam, which is very like social and political. You had people like Mamoru Oshii, who was, you know, has said the student movement influenced him, make stuff like Pat Labor, which was very political. You had stuff like Evangelion. I mean, you have like kind of these like strains of manga and anime that are thought of as being political and social, whereas like shoujo is stereotyped to be this like very only relationship thing focused. Not that that's bad at all, but like even within relationships, that can reflect a lot of political and social currents in the way that people are relating to each other, especially in queer relationships, you know, when that is a very political thing just by its very nature. So I think
its existence at all, which we're seeing over and over again as well. So you talked about how Ikuhara was also influenced by the student movement, and of course I think it's safe to say that anybody who was alive at that period of time was influenced by these things.
Mhm.
But also people who came after were influenced not just by the movement themselves, but by the art and the literature and the manga, because you had a lot of underground manga at that time, which was very much like woohoo, you know, radicalism and sex and stuff like that. Like Garo is full of that.
Yeah.
So how can you tell us a little bit about how Ikuhara was influenced by the student movement?
Yeah. So Ikuhara makes it really clear because in a lot of his interviews, I mean, he talks about, for example, wanting to hire J.A. Caesar to do the dual music,
Right.
most famously in Utena, who was considered a musician that was tied to the student movement. A lot of his works were associated with students, and he did the music for Shuji Terayama's plays, who was considered a very influential playwright and film director among students at the time. And so there's this great quote where Ikuhara says he wanted to have J.A. Caesar, his music be a part of Utena because he wanted the roar of the student movement, of the revolution to be present, which is so, you can really feel that, you know, when you see the shots of Utena going up the staircase for a million years with this like crazy operatic rock in the background. So I think the influence comes from a lot of different ways. It comes from J.A. Caesar. Terayama is one of Ikuhara's biggest influences. So I think the fact that he takes those influences into Utena brings the student movement with him. And also there are some interviews I've read translated with Ikuhara where he has this really interesting viewpoint towards revolution in general, to where he's very sympathetic with the aims of the student movement, but very critical of the way it ended up, you know, because it was so violent, because it was so patriarchal. And those criticisms were also echoed by Terayama himself. So I think the way Ikuhara brings that in is that he, you know, in a structure like Otori Academy, very oppressive, very patriarchal, you know, I think in that he reflects maybe some of the criticisms that the student movement brought against Japanese society. But, you know, you see that the revolution in Utena is the revolution between Utena and Anthi, you know, that's what it looks like. It's very personal. And I think Ikuhara places a lot of faith and importance in the way our personal relationships can be revolutionary. And he has much more skepticism towards the way that revolution can happen in a very big social and political way.
Right. Particularly at the end, you know, you see, has anything changed? Is the answer at the right? What has actually changed? The revolution happened. And what has changed, right? Is sort of what we're asked with. I've always felt that Anshi is the power to bring the revolution, that she is the power itself, and that Utena is the catalyst to activate that power, in a sense, a sort of, I don't know, Shiva Shakti sort of thing. And I always feel really bad for Akio, because he thought he was the Shiva, and he might have been once, you know, because we have layers of storytelling in that one too. And there's obviously the manga, there's the TV manga and the movie manga, and then there's the TV show and the movie, and they all tell the story differently. And then there's the 20th anniversary manga that looks back and kind of gives you a sense that nothing ever happened in the first place. Like nothing has changed. And it's a little frustrating, but also we're here again, you know? What other influences do you see in Utena?
Just to respond to that really quickly, just one other type of revolution that I think is in Revolutionary Guerrilla Utena, I think is really interesting, is the literal definition of things revolving and staying in place. And I think that is definitely true in terms of how Otori resets itself once Utena is gone. And I think there's a lot of interesting commentary there about, like, well, are personal relationships enough to change society, you know?
Right. And the movie particularly, literally, it's literally shifting in real time all the time. What part of it is real? What is meant to distract? I mean, if we are media consumers right now, you know, we can wake up in the morning and see, this is the important news in the media, but was that the important news? You know, and so here's the blackboards, you know, literally the chalkboard literally moving in front of us, which piece of information is important. And I think that becomes so such an incredible visual thing. Like, how much are you being distracted by the visuals, you know?
No, absolutely. And to get back to your earlier question, I think, I mean, definitely visually, I think someone like Terayama has a lot of influence on Utena because of how surreal it is, because of how the themes and motifs of Utena are not meant to be, I think grasped from literally understanding what's happening on the screen, because how can you do that when there's a student council meeting and there's a train running right through it, you know?
Right.
There's all
Baseball
these
game.
yeah, exactly. You know, like I think that a lot of the influence from Teriyama and some other like more surreal like directors is that like the literal truth isn't maybe the best way to understand reality. Maybe this maybe more surreal, abstract, you know, the language of
Symbolic
dreams.
truth, right?
Yeah, is a better way of understanding what's happening. And of course, I think Utena is super fascinating from the whole history of Yuri, because you have like Utena being this whole commentary on things like Rose of Versailles, on the Lady Prince as like a trope, you know. And I
Right.
think another fascinating thing is that like, well, maybe the Lady Prince as it had been represented at that time in stuff like Princess Knight or Rose of Versailles, I think Ikuhara takes the standpoint of that, well, maybe the Lady Prince in and of itself is a very patriarchal concept, and maybe instead of
Right.
striving to
Right.
be
It's
what men
about
are,
duty over anything else.
totally,
Right.
yeah,
So Oscar becomes the avatar for choosing duty, choosing justice over everything else, right? And
hmm
I have a section about that in my book, in fact, because then Utena asks us which is more important. Maybe neither are important. We don't really know where the right or the wrong is. And then we get somebody like Haruka later on in Sailor Moon, who's like, duty is important, but you know what? Screw it. Love wins.
yeah, absolutely,
So you get that.
yeah. No, that's such a good point too, and I think that's a really inspiring thing that I took away from Utena as well, is that like you know, love itself can be like a revolutionary act, because when you're expected to, for example, you know, for women become like good wives, wise mothers or whatever, but instead you choose, for example, a queer relationship, you know, lesbian relationship, which denies all these expectations you might have around reproduction and reproducing the Japanese state, that in and of itself is this crazy revolutionary act and should be like, I think, respected and treated as such, and not be diminished in the way we talk
Right.
about anime and manga, you know, because I think, again, a lot of that more explicitly political stuff is maybe privileged more for like academic interest than
Right.
something like
And it gets
Utena is.
abstracted by the time a lot of an audience was watching in 1999, which was way far away from 1974.
Yeah.
Maybe they're missing some of those things, you know, and that's why I think conversations like this is really important, because maybe we're looking at that and going, oh yeah, the revolution, you know, but we're
Mhm.
not thinking, what does that actually mean? And there are
Mhm.
so many layers in Utena, you can just parse it forever and ever and ever and never agree with anybody else in the room.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
so there's this idea that, you know, maybe symbols for symbol's sake are there. Maybe we can make meaning of them. And that has happened a lot. I've done lectures on Utena where people go, well, does it mean this? And I go, yes. If that's what you saw,
Yeah.
clearly, and I know that's unsatisfying, but it's just the truth. If you felt that that was what that thing symbolized, then yeah, it's there. You can't say no. Are you seeing any current trends in shoujo and yuri manga with recent protests against nuclear power, and also the growth of the queer movement politically, socially, and in manga in Japan?
Yeah, I mean, I just talking from my experience, and there's always a million things I haven't seen or watched, so I'm sure someone's gonna, you know, notice a ton of things that I'm not mentioning here. But I think for me, I maybe see less of explicitly political things like anti-nuclear sentiments being expressed in like Shoujo and Yuri, but I think there's a lot of revolutionary stuff happening in other ways. I think like Yuri as a genre is breaking far outside of like the class S sort of tropes, you know, that it came from. You see like Yuri, like Other Side Picnic had, you know, be in horror, you know, or you see like Witch for Mercury, which is this crazy social political drama.
Absolutely, it's Gundam full on. It's 100% Gundam-y.
Yeah, exactly. But within a Yuri, like, you know, sort of framework, you know, or you know, that the relationship being kind of the center of the show as well. I think that's like kind of revolutionary for the genre. Or you have, you know, just maybe more like normalizing of lesbian relationships and Yuri in general, in manga, or even in stuff like Isekai, like the Magical Revolution. I'm gonna butcher the title because it's so long. Oh
The
gosh.
reincarnated princess and the genius young lady.
Thank you. Yeah, that being like really good example.
Magi Revo is great.
Yeah, or Licorice Recoil,
Yeah.
having it be like more of like an action thing. So I think you do see Yuri branching out of maybe like a limited scope of only being relationship dramas to getting to be everything else, which I think is really revolutionary in and of itself for the medium.
And I'm going to also rep for I'm in Love with the Villainess, because
Yeah,
that
yeah,
series is overtly socially political. I mean, it's very politically aware. I
uh-huh.
mean, it's literally about a revolution. So you can add that to your thing, because it's literally about a game, a romance game called Revolution. And so the concept of revolution is deeply embedded in the story and very much part of the plot. But the revolutions that happen are also, there's also queer revolution, there's also just feminist revolution. So there's a lot of stuff going on that I feel it has taken those themes and really run with them in a very modern way. And using the isekai, which is just so popular right now, using the isekai format, it gives it a chance to constantly like harken back to, here's the thing that I'd like to say about current Japanese society that I can't really say otherwise, but now we can say it in this way, and I think that's really, really important also. And while it's not necessarily, look, I'm advocating for change right now, it is like oh, hey, yes, this needs to be fixed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you even see a lot of the people that worked on Utano or in other like Ikuhara productions address, very similar themes in their own work, like Review Starlight.
Yes.
I watched a bit of that earlier this year, and that's a really fascinating sort of critique of the sort of star system within the Takarazuka theater, and like this idea of like competition being introduced into art. I think that has a lot of political and social dimensions in it as well. So I do think it's present, but like, yeah, there's more stuff I need to see to probably get a better understanding of it. I will say one anecdote that I found interesting when doing this research is I reached out to the author of this book. I'm forgetting the name of the book, of course, right now, but it's about the role of women in the student movement and in the women's liberation movement. And I asked her about, whether the sort of after effects of the student movement ending as violently as it did, are there more social movements happening in Japan? Do we see kind of maybe like a thawing of that association with revolution happening? And she said she was kind of surprised, because when there's a lot of the climate protests happening in Japan, there really weren't that many sort of youth protests happening against climate change or for climate friendly policies in Japan. And she talked with some students who were participating in that, and she said that they noted that being an activist was sometimes considered to be a very socially restrictive thing in Japan, or something that could like put it sort of a taboo or mark on your back for being an activist. So I think social movements sometimes just have to be different in Japan because of this history. So even if it may not look, for example, like the Black Lives Matter movement in a lot of cities in Japan, or sorry, a lot of cities in America, to where you have these masses of people coming out into the streets, you might have rebellion happening in maybe more subtle ways. So I think I think for me, I've had to not think of social movements and revolution purely from a Western standpoint, but realize that rebellion, resistance can happen in all kinds of different ways outside of the framework that I'm familiar with.
Right. I would like to mention there's a couple of out local council members in Japan, and they are very constantly active. And there's also something that maybe people aren't aware of. It's called a group called Marriage for All Japan, and they have really taken social activism, but not protest, to very high levels. And they've gone to the Diet, and they've actually presented to Diet House members, lower mostly, I think, but they were giving them talking points and education, so that when somebody goes, well, blah 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 blah, because that's who you fight, right? You always end up debating the person who's like, well, why should I blah blah blah. And then what they do is they say, well, here's the answer. Here's a couple of ways you can address that. And so they are still doing activism. There is revolution.
Yeah.
And it's slow. And of course, the government is pushing back. It's got its foot on the neck of every possible form of revolution, whether it be anti-nuclear or whether it be LGBTQ plus equality. The government obviously is very happy having the power where it is and is always going to try to keep that as far down as possible. But you do have activism. And it just, yes, it looks like people going and talking and not necessarily, not that protests don't work, because they do and they're important, but sometimes activism looks like going and sitting down and talking to a local counselor and seeing if they can't get a local law changed. Much like we're seeing with the book banning and schools right now, where it's people are attacking these things from a very, very local level. And the only way we're going to stop that is also from a very local level.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it's fascinating too, because I think we also think of revolution having to be this very dramatic public thing. And sometimes it can be really gradual and boring, but it doesn't make it any less valid or important, even if it has to work within these existing structures. And even if it does, look like sitting down with your local counselor or trying to change policy from the inside, that can still have very dramatic impacts and very material impacts on people's lives that shouldn't be
absolutely
discounted.
Absolutely. So you had some questions for me.
Yes. Well, which one was the one you were interested in getting to?
So I wanted to talk about the revolutions in Yuri. So
okay. Yeah. So I mean, that was the big thing. Really, when I was reading your book, that's what I really wanted to know is what does the evolution of Yuri look like from the way I've understood it as being, in the 20s and 30s. You have, sort of class S books. You have works by Yoshia Nobuko. Hope I pronounced that close to right. And then you have kind of the next jump with, the Year 24 group in the 70s. I mean, what do you see as like the trajectory of Yuri and some of the most significant revolutions in Yuri throughout its history?
So I think the first thing I want to say is, talking about the stuff in the 30s, is the creation of girls' culture. And while I also know that a lot of that was created by men who were running the magazines and selling the books, and I understand that, but the idea that they created a space for girls and women to talk to each other was an enormous revolution, because really women did not have that. And girls in these schools writing these letters to the magazine saying, oh, this happened, here's a poem I wrote or something, and having that creative space to just express themselves is massive. I mean, it's just a massive revolution in the way women are given space. And I think that's going to be my probably my overarching argument, is about women making space for themselves. The thing that about the Magnificent 49ers, the Year 24 group, that is so extraordinary is that they also made space for their stories, for their interests, for their kinds of art. Up to that point, there were definitely women in manga, but the people creating the manga or requiring the manga were typically men, even for stories for girls. And here are women who grew up with stories for girls written by men, who are like, I want stories for me by me. And they carved out an important space for themselves, saying, these are the kinds of stories we want to read, and actually changed the world in doing so, because they created an entire genre, not meaning necessarily to do that. So when you get those kinds of things where women carve out space for something bigger and newer, that will always be, to me, the main revolution. So again, what we're seeing right now is queer folks carving out space. So you're seeing more josei Yuri women. It's a Yuri by adult women for a presumed adult audience. And they're carving out space for other queer women. So you have Yuzaki Sakaomi's She Loves to Cook, She Loves to Eat, which is about an explicitly queer, a woman who doesn't realize she's queer, two women, in fact, who don't really realize they're queer, realizing it and coming to create an alternate family. And they become family, and they bring people around them who are also queer, and together they build a community. And the thing I like about She Loves to Cook, She Loves to Eat, other than the fact that it's very much about the food, which is great, and it's stuff you could make at home, so it's not like really high-end stuff. It's not like Oishimbo. You could just go ahead and make whatever. But what I love about it is that the revolution is we've made space for ourselves and other people. We're bringing people around us to build a larger community. And we are not seeing the real world. Real world issues are in this story. And it's like, yes, these things were formative for us. These are real experiences that we had or I'm having, but they are not the sum and total of me.
Mm-hmm.
And so much queer literature and art for the entire 20th century and well into the 21st was rooted in trauma. And I have my end chapter is all about how we have to look forward. And these stories look forward. Something like Magi Revo, where you have two young ladies who change the world. And they go, well, here's the situation where we have these factions that don't like each other. Why can't we make them work together for everybody? You know, why can't we rethink this whole idea? And that rethinking of how we see family and community and society is a gigantic revolution. And to have it in comics is so powerful because the people reading that don't realize that's what they're reading. You don't come into a comic going, yeah, political comic, unless it's like Mouse. I mean, you basically pick up a comic because you want a good story and cool art. And then the next thing you know, you're like, why do we do that? You know, and that's the important part for what I see as the current revolution, is rethinking things that we have assumed to be the case. And the LGBTQ community in Japan is currently right now trying to get the larger society to go, why do we assume no gay people can have children? That's provably false, right? So why do we just assume that? Because the NHK once in 1990 did a TV show about that, and you, mom, have literally never let go of that TV show. Real thing that happened. And that's what happens, right? We're trying to make these revolutions by carving more space for ourselves and making that space as safe and as broadly welcoming as possible. So I think that's what we're seeing a lot of in Yuri right now.
Yeah, I mean, I really love your point about trying to move sort of queer stories beyond trauma. Because I think having, you know, queer characters get to be whole people is revolutionary. Unfortunately, it's a low bar to clear, but it is at this point. I remember I was watching Skip and Loafer this year, and there's a trans woman in that show who's this, you know, wonderful, caring sort of auntie character towards the protagonist, and I think she's such a great representation of that, because she, you know, she isn't introduced as here's this, you know, trans woman who has like a horribly tragic backstory or whatever. Like she just gets to be caring and funny and stylish, and some of her like backstory comes out kind of naturally over the course of the story,
right? And not just this like trauma dump.
Exactly.
You know,
it's not like,
which I get in a narrative. Sometimes, yes, you have to do that, right?
Yeah,
but you don't want that to be the sum and total of the character.
Completely. Yeah, exactly. They, you know, should get to be as complex and messy and nuanced as anyone else gets to be.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I've heard nothing but good things about Skip and Loafer too. So even though it's not an explicitly Yuri or queer story, I've heard great things about it as a shoujo. So I hope people are reading and watching that one. Yeah, I mean, I think that the changes that we're seeing are definitely rooted in social revolution. But again, manga is a place where we grow to love a character or like a thing that happened or a plot or something, and it's always about personal growth and being able to combine those two things for like a really great story is just like extra wonderful. You know?
Yeah. No, I mean, completely, and that's what's really yeah, I don't know. So I always find myself having more interesting Yuri and queer characters to know more about than I know what to do with, which is a great problem to have.
Isn't that fabulous? It's like people will say to me, have you read something? I'm like, no. How awesome.
Yeah, and I think that's what's a great, maybe, you know, revolution since Utena is that I think, at least my understanding at the time, is that that show was a very clear break and very subversive, just like Sailor Moon was, because you have it being explicitly about, you know, lesbian characters or queer characters, especially in the movie, and now something that maybe was seen as more revolutionary today is maybe becoming a little bit more commonplace, or gets to exist in all types of other genres and all types of different stories rather than it just being a part of this one specific tradition.
And even at the time when Utena came out, a lot of people just didn't see it as queer at all. They just didn't. I did a presentation at a Tampa Bay Film Festival for it, and immediately when it was done, a Japanese woman came up and says, "Just akogare," and I said, "I understand your point, but to those of us who are queer, it absolutely isn't." So I get it that you managed to see that more general seishun sort of adolescence thing in it. And of course, adolescence is beat to death in the title and in the music of Utena. So you do get this sort of like, oh, it's just adolescence. It's not real. It's all fantasy. And there's that. So I think that we're having more explicit, like, this is a queer story by a queer person. P.S. That is definitely a major, major change these days.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially with I've been trying to read through all of my lesbian experience with loneliness and her works after that, which I learned about through your book. And that's such a fantastic example because it is, queer story written by a queer person, and again talking not only about queerness but about like mental health and family expectations,
physical health, and right, exactly.
Yeah.
And the bits about gender and sexuality are not the point. They are part of the story. You're getting bits of her brain.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating.
Totally. Yeah, no, I think that's a really great example of the type of queer sort of stories that are very revolutionary and very exciting and fun for me to read these days. Is just ones that get to be explicit. You don't have to hide behind all the subtext, and you get to just be very frank about your lives and your stories, and they get to be just as rich as anyone else's.
That's great. Do you have any last thoughts on your topic?
Gosh, I mean, I guess I should say this is all in the purpose of me writing a video essay about it, which was supposed to be much shorter, but it's now my script is 60 pages long. But eventually that'll be done, and I'm excited to share that when it's finished. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe one last interesting thing that I didn't bring up is that at the end of the student movement, one book I read was called Otaku Database Animals makes a point, pretty broad argument that after the student movement, you sort of see the rise of the otaku generation. And the point that the author makes is that after the sort of death of political potential in Japan, that's when you have people's idea of kind of revolution and trying to think of different possibilities for society have to happen within stories and within fiction, which I think is maybe unfortunate on one level because you want to be able to bring that into the realm of politics more explicitly, but on another level I think goes to show why a lot of these stories are really important, and why fiction can be this beautiful place to imagine a better world or imagine a better society. And I think maybe my little critique, if I could ever talk to Ikuhara, would be that could you be any more optimistic maybe about the idea of social revolution not only ending in tragedy and this kind of these power grabs? Can you also have these beautiful, loving, queer relationships and also have the political movement to back it up? Can we dream bigger than thinking that we can only change society through our personal relationships, but structurally everything's going to be the same forever?
I am 100% with you, and not just of Ikuhara. I mean, I think a lot of things. Even I am Love the Villainous. It has a very oh well, but we didn't get a vote for the women. I'm why not? Why didn't you see? Why didn't you take that opportunity to just go? I understand that it was meant as commentary, sort of a bitter commentary on the issues in Japan, but why not? Excuse me. Why not think bigger and broader? And in creating the bigger and better and safer and more inclusive, you will manage to communicate that these are possibilities that some people don't even really understand exists.
Yeah.
So I'm 100% with you on that. Where can people find you if they want to talk to you about this?
Oh gosh, I am really not well connected in social media. Probably my email, honestly, right now. I'm not a very active Twitter user or anything like that.
I'll put that in the show notes then, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, people can just email me if they're interested in learning more. And then, whenever I have this video to put out, I'm sure I'll try and be more active on social media to promote myself a little bit better.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Paul. That was amazing. This was a fantastic topic. I hadn't thought about it. And you approaching me was like, this was great. I was just so excited to talk about this. And so thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Yeah, again, thanks so much for having me. This has been so fun to talk about.